O God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come, our shelter from the stormy...
Welcome to the King's Hand in History podcast. I'm Chris Van Duzen.
And I'm Casey Hoost, and we're here to proclaim the King's glorious deeds.
On this episode, we are discussing the King's Hand through the Plymouth Brethren, who later became, generally speaking, the Brethren movement came out of the Plymouth Brethren, at least partly. So we're going to discuss this group that's formed in the early 1800s, and one of its prominent figures is the famous man John Darby, J.N. Darby, who founded the dispensationalist movement. That's what came out of this movement. This is a denomination that is not a denomination because they don't like to be called a denomination.
Yeah. Even the name Plymouth Brethren is not a name they assigned to themselves. It was given.
Right. However, they are a denomination, even though they are anti-denominational. But it's one of the smaller Protestant groups today. They are worldwide now, but so the distinctions of this group is that they do not have a clergy-laity distinction. They don't have official ordained ministers, and the meetings. First of all, when they gather together, there is one meeting exclusively devoted to the Lord's Supper, and also during at least one of the meetings. There is a more open system of believers, believing men being able to share encouragement and instructions from the scriptures. I guess those would be the distinctions of them. Can you think of any others?
I think those are the main ones, and as we talk, we'll see some of the more nuances of them. So
we're just going to go with, basically, I think we'll just go through the 1800s, right? We won't really get into modern day.
Yeah, I don't even think we'll make it to the end of the 1800s, but...
Okay, but they didn't really change much after the 1800s anyway.
And we might reference a little bit of how things are in the current church, but...
Yeah, definitely. But to start us off, I want to read 1 Corinthians 12, because this is kind of one of the bases for the it would be the priesthood of all believers would be the doctrine from the Reformation that would be most applied to the way that the brethren function in their meetings together. And you can get this from 1 Corinthians 12. So this is talking about the body of Christ and how we are supposed to function together. And Paul says, starting with verse 4. Now, there are varieties of gifts, but the same Spirit, and there are varieties of ministries, and the same Lord. There are varieties of effects, but the same God who works all things in all persons. But each one is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. For to one is given the word of wisdom through the Spirit, and to another the word of knowledge according to the same Spirit. To another faith by the same Spirit, and to another gifts of healing by the one Spirit. And to another the effecting of miracles, and to another prophecy, and to another the distinguishing of spirits, to another kinds of tongues, and to another the interpretation of tongues. But one and the same Spirit works all these things, distributing to each one individually just as he wills. For even as the body is one, and yet has many members, and all the members of the body, though they are many, are one body, so also is Christ. For by one Spirit we were all baptized into one body, whether Jews or Greeks, whether slaves or free, and we were all made to drink of one Spirit. For the body is not one member, but many. If the foot says, because I am not a hand, I am not a part of the body, is not for this reason any less a part of the body. And if the ear says, because I am not an eye, I am not a part of the body, is not for this reason any less a part of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would the hearing be? If the whole were hearing, where would the sense of smell be? But now God has placed the members, each one of them, in the body, just as he desired. If they are all one member, where would the body be? But now there are many members, but one body. And the eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you, or again the head to the feet, I have no need of you. On the contrary, it is much surer that the members of the body which seem to be weaker are necessary. And those members of the body which are deemed less honorable, on these we bestow more abundant honor, and our less presentable members become much more presentable, whereas our more presentable members have no need of it. But God has so composed the body, giving more abundant honor to that member which lacked, so there may be no division in the body, but that the members may have the same care for one another. And if one member suffers, all the members suffer with it. If one member is honored, all the members rejoice with it. And And then he goes on to the different gifts. God has appointed in the church apostles, prophets, teachers, miracles, gifts, healings, helps, ministrations, and so on. All are not all these. There's not just one type of gift. They're all different. But earnestly desire the greater gifts. He ends it in verse 31. So the issue, two major issues that will come into play with the brethren, at least when they start forming, is what constitutes the unity of the body of Christ. Why are there so many different denominations? Why are we divided up into those sects? And also, why is there a one-man ministry? That's a big emphasis in the beginning. That with the clergy laity distinction, with ordained ministers who perform most of the duties, especially the teaching duties of the church, no one else is allowed to really most of the time even open their mouths in order to give an encouragement or exhortation or a lesson during the weekly assembly. So those are the main issues we'll be looking at today: the clergy laity distinction and the unity of the body of Christ, and what constitutes our unity. How are we one, and what should define us as Christians? So to start off, we start in now, Casey, I read that there was some brethren type movement in New York City in the 1820s. You know anything about that?
I do not.
Okay. Well, Ironside, H.A. Ironside, the famous brethren commentator, he's part of the brethren movement. He actually references this, but he doesn't say anything really about it.
Now, I wouldn't be surprised though, because even if you look at how they first gathered, like, I imagine a lot of Christians have done this once or twice, where it's basically the first meetings were several different groups when they realized, hey, we're all doing this, and they got together. And what they were doing was, say if you had somebody like Edward Cronin, we're talking Dublin, Ireland at this point, that was a dissenter from the Anglican Church and was basically said, you're not allowed to take communion. But he was a Christian, believed in what the Bible said, and he had another friend that was not allowed to take communion, so they said, well, we'll get together and we think we can do communion by ourselves. And so that's what they did. And so what I'm saying, in that probably a lot of Christians have done this, is, say if there's a snowstorm or something and you can't go to church on that Sunday, you say, oh, we'll do it ourselves, type of thing. That's kind of how this started, except for with communion involved. Except for not because of a snowstorm, but because the Anglican Church had said, you are not allowed to take our communion because of your beliefs. They said, all right, well, we think we can just, looking at the Bible, I don't see any reason, is what they said, that we can't do communion on our own. And so then you get a little group of people like this that are taking communion on their own and having this little worship service with, as you made very clear, no clergy. And as they look at the scriptures, they're saying, we don't see the need for clergy biblically.
Right.
And so they have a few different groups of like this that they in Dublin, Ireland, that they find out, hey, there's other people meeting like this, and they get together into a bigger group. And then the idea starts to spread over to England. You get Plymouth was obviously the big one. Within a decade, in the 1840s, I saw something that said an average Sunday would have 12 to 1,400 people. Which I will point out, too, is, at least for the brethren churches that I am aware of now, they go more for a model of splitting before they get that big. But at the time, though, in Plymouth, this is quite a number of people. And so that's why they're called the Plymouth Brethren, is because Plymouth was the biggest area where people recognized, and there was actually the brethren in Plymouth, because they would call each other brother.
Right.
Like brothers and sisters, and they didn't want a name for themselves, as you indicated.
Yeah, no, they were taking the term brethren from the New Testament, where most of the time, especially in Paul's letters, he calls his audience brethren.
Yeah. And
brothers and sisters.
Yep. And so they were calling each other brothers and sisters. But so the name
brethren.
Yeah, and the name given to them from outsiders was the Brethren in Plymouth. And which turned into the Plymouth Brethren. But so it actually started in Dublin, and then you get a group in Plymouth. You get another group in Bethesda shortly after, which is like near Bristol, and pretty quickly spreads through England. And as we get into John,
what date did it start?
So I have 1826 for Dublin, and by 1832 there were also groups in Plymouth and Bristol. And as we get into John Nelson Darby, he was a big church establisher. He traveled a lot. He established a lot of churches. So we're talking by the 1840s, 1850s. There's hundreds of these churches. And again, England's kind of the hub of this, where it's spreading through England, but you also have continental Europe, you have Switzerland, you have Germany, you have Denmark some, you have the United States, Canada, Australia, and these are Darby went to all these places several times. He traveled a lot. And so it really spreads very quickly. And one of the reasons it spreads actually is that it was a little bit like the Second Great Awakening, not in that how they preached.
It was during the Second Great Awakening.
It was, and it was actually, and so it was a similar type of idea, but where the preaching style was more like, was kind of going against the clergy of like stuffy, like you have to follow this, but more like, no, like you can be a believer. It's not that hard,
right?
Type of thing. You can join us now.
Well, we have to remember they most of the former brethren in the United Kingdom and Ireland and England, they were former Anglican Church members.
Yes.
In the Anglican Church, the sermons are not like extemporaneous. The sermons are mostly they were like formatted based on what the church gave you. In fact, the church actually had homilies that was given to the priest to preach to the congregation.
Yeah.
Now, I want to also back up a little and just give a bit of background, because this is not the first time something like this happened. Because we see dissenting groups before this. You see the Puritans, you see the Congregationalists, you see the Baptists as well, and the Presbyterians as well. Yep. So this is just one of several groups that broke off from the Anglican Church, going against the high church of the Anglicans. They're seeing it's a New Testament revival. They're seeing the New Testament teaching that every believer has a gift, and every believer should be able to use his gift, and you shouldn't have one set of men that is specially designated to be the only ones to deliver messages to other believers. Yeah. So who are the first figures that started this movement?
All right. So
and how did they start?
Yeah. So I mean, I kind of said how they started. Is like Edward Cronin is there? It's actually kind of, there's several different guys that are accredited with being the first one, but basically you get several of them that were early on. Edward Cronin is one, and basically he was a dissenter that was taken out of communion, and so he just met with a couple of his friends. Was Anthony Norris Groves,
because he was against the clergy laity distinction, right? Or right?
I believe so. Yeah. Okay. He may have also believed in believers' baptism. Okay. And so this is I think another thing too was that because it was in Dublin, there was less of a Baptist, presence there. Yeah. And so reading this, like, I do think that some of these guys would have joined a Baptist group had there been one. Yeah. But so Anthony Norris Groves, who actually, and this is another aspect of the Brethren, started a big missionary movement. He went to Baghdad, I think it was. We're talking in like 1840, I think. And that was another thing, was that these guys were generally very, very mission oriented. I know, I'm trying to think of probably the best known missionary through the history of the Brethren is Jim Elliot. A lot of you guys have probably heard of him. But so he was very early on. Obviously, John Nelson Darby, who we'll talk about later. Shortly after that was George Mueller, another very famous.
But he was in the late 1800s, right?
No, he was
mid-1800s.
by like 1832. He was one of the
Okay.
Okay. He was at Bristol.
Gotcha.
Those are probably the big names very early on, and yeah. So again, just on the things they stressed, one was just simplicity, was just taking the Bible and just going from that, and that's how they came to, in their minds, to just trying to set up a New Testament church the way that it was in the New Testament, and also with the whole, they didn't want to be a denomination, and so very much trying to be non-sectarian at first, trying to be, we're open to Christians coming,
right.
type of thing, and yeah. So missions we talked about. Oh, weekly communion, which you mentioned, was very important. Of course, at that time, most places were doing weekly communion.
Yes.
And that is something, a little bit of a distinction for today, that the Brethren churches do weekly communion. That a lot of churches no longer do that.
Right.
So yeah, I guess I'll talk about John Nelson Darby a bit. He was... Oh no, I did want to mention before I get into him. In general, when you read about these guys, it's pretty impressive in that they're, for not being clergy, many of them are very well educated.
Right.
And many of them write.
Well, Cronin is a dentist, I believe.
Yeah, and you do have a couple like John Nelson Darby that were clergy,
right, in
the Anglican Church and left. But many of them write books, pamphlets, articles, all this type of stuff, and are highly regarded. And I think this is a result of not having a single clergyman or a couple clergy that lead, is that there's more onus on the men to study, to learn. And so as a whole, and I think I've found this in my experience with men in the assemblies,
now, the assemblies being what? What are you talking about when you talk about assemblies?
So
the assemblies.
Yeah,
what are the assemblies?
I would.
Most people don't know what the assemblies are.
So that's kind of what we call the kind of descendants of the Brethren movement.
The Brethren churches.
The Brethren churches. They split into a few different ways, but yeah, it's one of the descendants of it where, as we get there, it's the open Brethren basically, and as we get to the split and which way, I'll describe that a little further for what that is now. But basically, they are the assemblies is what people call it when they come from the Plymouth Brethren movement, and have a lot of these same themes and emphasis.
They call their churches assemblies because they're assemblies.
Yeah.
And actually, the New Testament, the Greek word translated church means assembly. So that's another biblical thing that we can learn from that.
So
we were talking about Darby, though, I think.
I was just about
the education.
Yeah, and so a lot of the guys that they're getting from are middle to upper class.
Right.
A lot of people that are educated enough to really read through and be like, I don't think this is accurate what the Anglican Church is doing. They get I think they got the nephew of the Duke of Wellington, which if for those of you that really know your history, the Duke of Wellington was like a big deal.
Yeah.
But yeah, so back to Darby. He was born, I think, 1800, and he was very bright. Studied to become a lawyer for a while, and then wasn't sure what he wanted to do, and then he went into Anglican clergy, became a priest, and was stationed over in Ireland near Dublin, and was very evangelistic, and converted many Catholics to the Anglican Church. Was very out and wanted to go out among the poor, and was very persuasive. And
what's interesting is, according to Ironside, he was actually a minister of the Church of Ireland. Apparently, there was a separate church.
Yeah,
of
I think
Ireland.
it was. So
was it like it was the Anglican version?
Yeah, and
it was the Irish version of the Anglican Church.
And it was,
is that what it was?
But it was underneath the English Church. Or not like it was part of it, because the reason that he left was that I think at that point there was a new king came. Like I think George IV inherited the throne, and he was not a good person. And the Anglican Church decreed that to be a member of the Anglican Church, you had to swear fealty to him or something like that.
Okay.
And so in Ireland, though, for all these Catholics of Ireland that he had converted, for them to say to have to swear fealty to George IV, they're like, that's crazy. I'm not going to do that. And he didn't want him to. He's like, yeah, that's wrong. And that was why he left, or one of the main reasons why he left. But he's also studying the scriptures, which he did a lot. And like, for instance, he translated the Bible into 3 different languages. And he obviously, coming up with dispensationalism, he went through the Bible extensively. But so as he's reading through it, he's seeing a lot of things that he disagrees with the Anglican Church. And about that time period is when these groups in Dublin are forming, and he quickly gets tied into them and becomes a prominent leader because of, his education in the church, his study of the Bible, and like I said, he's very persuasive. Yeah. He's a very good speaker, and he has high energy levels. When we just think about how much he traveled, they say he established over 1,500 churches in his lifetime in translating the Bible that much. And so he is a very prominent figure almost immediately in this group.
And when he started associating with them, he was still actually what's called a curate of the Church of Ireland. He didn't immediately leave his
It wasn't until,
post.
I believe, I'm trying to remember, it may have been Benjamin Mills Newton that invited him over to Plymouth.
Okay.
As basically to say, so in Plymouth, England, they were starting up a church similar to what was going on in Dublin, and Benjamin Mills Newton had met Darby and asked him to come over and kind of help him. And so Darby then is associated with Plymouth, and him and Benjamin Mills Newton are kind of the first two. I don't know if they use the term elder yet at that point. They were
elders, though.
They basically were. They were the two that were setting up the church, and they worked together. And so Darby, eventually his home base basically becomes Plymouth, and it's from there that things go on. Which I think, talking about Darby now, we can talk about dispensationalism.
All right.
So
before we do that, let's take a short break. So this is a good time for a break. We'll be back in a little bit. Hey, do you enjoy studying the Bible, reading it, and learning what it means to follow Jesus and obey him faithfully? Well, I have a blog called bearingchrist.blog. Its motto is to know Christ and him crucified. There I have hundreds of Bible study articles, devotionals, book reviews, as well as analysis on current events and how we are to live as Christ bearers in this present evil age. Also there you can check out my new recent book that was just published this year called The New Testament Revival of Western Christianity, How to Restore the Love, Leadership, and Learning that the Apostles taught. I think it would be a blessing to you. You can get a PDF version for a very limited price there, and you can also find it on Amazon in print and Kindle editions. Again, it's bearingchrist.blog, to know Christ and him crucified. And we're back talking about Darby and his dispensationalism. How he saw it through his study of the Bible, and how he promulgated it to others. Yeah. So, Casey, take it away.
Yeah, I guess I'll start with a little background here. So, a lot of people were thinking more about end times at this period. So, when Darby was born in 1800. So, in 1800, what was going on was the Napoleonic Wars, where France tried to take over all of Europe, pretty much. From 1800 to 1815, they basically did. And in 1815, you have this whole, as he's a kid, just this almost like world war going on.
It was a world war.
It was, yeah. And finally, 1815, there is victory, but there's also just all this turmoil and cleanup from this, and like nobody ever seen a war like this before. And then also, which I didn't know this before I studied this, in 1816, there was a volcanic eruption in the Indonesian islands, and it basically wiped out summer for everybody. And
Right.
so,
I remember.
Yeah.
Actually, no. Maybe I'm thinking of there was later on another one. It was a mini ice age, though, right?
So I think there was one in the
40s, 1840s.
Maybe, but like. I do believe that you're right that there was another one too.
Yeah. This was a mini ice age.
But like so, for instance, on this in June in Virginia, people were sledding down hills because it kept snowing.
Yeah.
And there basically wasn't a summer that year, and like you have periods where the sun is covered by clouds, and so you have this world war going on which nobody ever seen before. You have this very strange weather. People start turning to their Bibles and being like, this sounds like things that would happen at the end times. So you do get a little bit of that going on. So as we're studying this, and I will say with dispensationalism, a lot of focus is on the end times view of it, but it is more comprehensive than that.
Right.
And Darby wrote about a lot of things, not just the end times.
Right.
And so he gets a lot of focus on the end times, but he wrote about everything.
He pretty much was a systematic theologian.
Kind of like Calvin gets a lot of focus on the predestination, but he wrote about everything.
Right. Well, most things.
Yeah, most things. Speaking of which, a little side note. On Calvin and the early brethren, almost all of them were Calvinists. Like John Nelson Darby was a strict Calvinist. George Mueller was. You go through all the elders; they almost all are, which is interesting because in the brethren churches today, especially the open brethren, it is generally more common for them to not be Calvinists.
Right.
But
I think that's the tendency for most
churches,
most Protestant denominations.
And even I would say
Reformed.
And I would say most of the brethren hold to dispensationalism. And that dispensationalism is a lot of times tied to not Calvinism, though I do know Calvinists that are dispensationalists,
right.
But I think because it's opposite of covenant theology,
right?
And so covenant theology going with the Reformed, and the Reformed are usually Calvinists, so a lot of times you get more commonly you get dispensationalists that aren't Calvinists,
right?
But that's not to say you can't be a Calvinist and a dispensationalist at the same time,
right?
Anyway, so on dispensationalism. At this time, Darby's really studying, and he comes to the conclusion of, and I won't say it's completely made up on his own. There are things looking back where people have had some similar ideas. He just puts it together more systematically.
Right.
And the big one is dispensations, cutting the timeline of God up into the different ways that God dealt with people at different times. So currently, I think he put 7. And basically said, currently we are waiting for Christ's return.
Mm-hmm.
And then in that is, in Christ's return, the pre-trib rapture.
Mm-hmm.
He said...
Pre-tribulation.
Yeah. And correct me if I'm wrong on any of this. You probably know this better than I do. And also, a big thing at this time, too, was switching from postmillennialism to premillennialism. Basically saying that the world is going to get worse. The world's going to get worse until Christ returns. Whereas post-millennials were going out of phase at that point. And they had basically said...
Out of phase? What do you mean?
It was...
Popular?
It was popular. And
especially in the Anglican Church, I'm guessing?
But even in like the Puritans, like Jonathan Edwards...
Right, the Puritans definitely were a lot of them.
But I guess,
but actually, it's a little more divided than that because many of them were amillennialists as well. I mean,
that's true.
There was a large portion that were postmillennialists, but many were
I guess so.
Amillennialists.
So we see though the rise to the premillennialism, where things are going to get worse. Whereas the postmillennials thought the church is going to keep growing and growing until we bring Christ in. Premillennials think things are going to get worse and worse and worse until Christ returns.
Now, right, but a huge another distinctive of premillennialism is that Jesus has a literal 1,000 year reign on a semi-perfect earth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Though Darby would say first Jesus comes back and raptures the church, then there's the 7 years of tribulation, and then he comes back again and sets up the 1,000-year reign on earth.
Yeah, that's dispensationalist premillennialism.
Yep. And so in that
tribulation,
another couple things, literalism of prophecy. Mm-hmm. So just
that's the key to getting to dispensationalism.
Yeah. So just taking it as literally as possible.
Right. To the point of fall.
Yeah, which is always
Woodenly literal.
Yeah.
But especially prophecy, like focusing upon prophecy, that these things must have the things in all of prophecy must refer to something literal. This must be literal. For example, Book of Revelation.
Yeah.
All those symbols, you have to somehow take them, as much as possible. You have to take them literally.
Yeah, which, is tough. And then the other big one is these.
But also I want to point out another thing that leads to this, leads to this tendency, is that you have to assume that that some of the promises given to Old Testament Israel are unfulfilled. The two main ones being the land promise, and the blessing. Yeah, the blessing promise. Even though the one promise of what are the promises given to Abraham? Land, posterity, and blessing. Right. So the land promise, at the very least, is unfulfilled. That's the main one they focus on.
And so kind of right off that is a separation of Israel and the church.
Right.
They're distinct. God has different plans for them. And right now we are bringing in the church, but God's going to rapture the church at the very beginning of the tribulation.
What does it mean to rapture the church?
It means to take them up into the air and take them out of the earth.
Right.
And take them up to heaven, I guess.
Like rapture, like the word itself, it means like an ecstasy or something like that. Like,
oh yeah,
like
that's true.
Like you feel feel rapture.
Yeah.
Rapture being I think it literally means taken up. That's what it means.
And so the church will be taken up, and then the 7-year tribulation is when the Jews come back. Mm-hmm. So that'll be God's dealing with the Jews. And I think, is the 1,000 years a Jewish kingdom? I'm not sure on
Basically, the Jews are the Jews in dispensationalism are they're like the what's the word? They are the prominent, distinguished people of the millennium.
Yeah.
So they are they're like, there's going to be a Jewish nation that does all the Jewish things, the temple rituals and so on, and they are going to be the prominent ones of the distinguished ones of the millennial.
And so then also in this, and this is one that has always given me pause, but there different sections of Scripture are meant for the Jews. Mm-hmm. And some, like for instance, Matthew 24 is a big one.
No, this was Darby. This was
Darby. I believe it was Darby. Yeah.
Okay.
And so that like Matthew 24, they say this is mostly for the Jews.
And what's Matthew 24?
It's when Peter asks, what will be the sign of the things to come at the end, and Jesus, explains. And I don't have it open before me, and I didn't really
the Olivet Discourse.
I didn't really look at it. I don't know if there's a specific place where they make the distinction of now it's time that he's just talking about the Jews. Right. But they do say at some point, this section is for the Jews, this section is for the Gentiles, and as they go through, they try to distinguish who's he talking to and who it applies to. Okay. And that's kind of from Darby. So that's kind of dispensationalism in a nutshell. So then explaining. And obviously, most of you have probably heard of the pre-trib rapture. I guess that's the one of the more popular things now. Right. But so, just an extended little look ahead before we get back to the brethren is, as Darby travels all around, he teaches this view. One of the guys he gets connected to that publishes a Bible after he's dead is Schofield.
Now, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Is Darby coming to these conclusions mainly on his own, or does he have friends that also are coming to these conclusions at around the same time?
So it's a mix.
Okay.
A lot of the other elders of the brethren denounce these views.
Okay.
But he does win over some.
Yeah.
And so it's not like everybody's telling him this is wrong. Some people are like, "Oh, I see what you're getting at,"
Yeah.
but it's not like everybody's telling him, "Yes, you've got it." There's a lot of people saying like, "No, like you're just speculating on prophecy here. You're going way too far." So there's a mixed camp.
And around what time was he coming to these views?
So
and teaching them.
This was early on. I mean, like
1830s, 1840s,
yeah, by
1840s.
by the 1830s.
I think 1837 is when the Plymouth Brethren were formed, right?
No, 1826 was the first one.
Okay, that's the Plymouth
By
Brethren.
1832, I think Plymouth was the one.
Okay.
It was when he came there. By the 1830s, he has these views. 1820s, he's saying things that are kind of precursors to these. Hasn't all put it together quite yet. And so, so there's mixed reception on these views. So he goes around, he teaches them, and as I said, one of the people that has come to his side on this, when he dies, publishes a Bible, and this is Scofield. And the Scofield Bible, reference Bible, became a huge, one of like the major type reference Bibles of its time.
His first name is Charles. Is that Charles?
That sounds right. I'm not sure.
I know his initials are C.I. Schofield.
Yeah.
Who was Schofield? I think he was a businessman, wasn't he?
He may have been.
Okay.
I didn't really study him too much.
Look up on him. We know for a fact that he was an ardent disciple of Darby. Obviously.
So I would say,
he was an American.
He was an American, and I also would say I didn't have time to look into this. The differences between Scofield and Darby on dispensationalism, there were some,
right?
And so the Scofield dispensationalism view that's really promoted in the reference Bible is not just because it says it there. It's not verbatim what Darby taught,
right?
But so this becomes, and I don't know if it's Darby or the Scofield Bible or was it, but one of the big denominations that really was won over to this were the Baptists. At some point, I'm not sure what time period. Late 1800s. And so even today, most Baptists, by default, a lot of them in there to become a member, it talks about dispensationalism and adhering to that. Dispensationalism is the default Baptist view now.
Right.
And so I would even say it is the. Tell me what you think on this. It's almost like the default Christian view.
Yeah.
That
evangelical.
Evangelical. Yeah.
Because it was because in the 1900s, like in the mid 1900s, it just exploded.
Yeah. Oh, and another thing that really went with that was Israel becoming a nation again.
Right. Because in 1949, that's why. Yeah.
And so a lot of
dispensationalism said that the land promise, what I was talking about. God had not fulfilled the land promise for Israel, and he was beginning to fulfill the land promise by giving the Jews the land.
Yeah, and then even in
1949. So a lot of dispensationalists point to that, saying, "See, this is what dispensationalism teaches. This is what the Bible prophecy teaches, that God would give the land to a newly constituted nation of Israel," and that's what happened in 1949.
Yeah.
Although it's not the same Israel as the Israel that God was talking about in the Old Testament, but let's go on.
But yeah, so it's obviously become very popular. That's why a lot of people, when they list most prominent or most influential Protestant theologians, teachers, Darby will be on that list.
Yeah.
Largely because of the dispensationalist teaching and how prominent that is today. So anyway, back to the 1830s with the Brethren movement in England, mostly Plymouth. You get in the 1830s. So I mentioned Benjamin. Sorry, I said Mills earlier. I think it's Wills. Benjamin Wills Newton. I'm not really sure. I thought it was Mills, but I wrote Wills. One of those two. I'll just say Benjamin Newton.
I don't think Wills does not sound proper.
No, it doesn't.
Benjamin Newton.
Yeah, put Brethren next to it so you don't get somebody else.
Wills.
Okay, it is Wills. I did write it correctly. Must be my mind just thought Mills sounded better too.
It does.
So in the 1830s, remember they kind of founded the church together in Plymouth, and Benjamin Wills Newton kind of starts to raise the alarm on Darby's new dispensationalism. Say, he's gone off kilter on this. He's preaching, speculative prophecy things, and that's not at all what we're about. We're trying to just be simple New Testament and didn't really see an emphasis on that.
Now, do you know what Newton's background was? Was he a former clergyman?
Oh, I read
or
about
was
it.
He just a businessman? I just had it up.
Yeah. And so, and Benjamin Wills Newton was very educated, and so he went through and he agreed with Darby on some of the things, but disagreed on, like, the separation of Israel and the church. He disagreed with, I think he was a premillennialist is what it was. He was a premillennialist, but the pre-trib rapture and the separation of church and Israel, he did not see. And so he kind of starts raising the alarm on Darby about that, and they start to have some tension build between them. And Darby then leaves on one of his trips to go establish more churches on the continent, and when he gets back, the tension between Newton and Darby kind of boils over. And hold on, I'm just looking at my notes for the timeline here. So at one point, Newton published something that supposedly was in error, and I guess, and we kind of talked about this, is a lot of people said it was an error. It was hard to find exactly what he said, which he, after a little while, and all the recourse from, like, George Mueller said it was, Craik is another one of the elders, Chapman was another one, they all said, yeah, you're kind of off on this, and so he apologized, and said he was praying for forgiveness, and retracted the thing. But Darby insisted that Newton hadn't truly renounced his errors, and that he was wrong, and basically.
Now the error was his criticism of Darby.
No, it was on.
He had a doctrinal.
A doctrinal thing, even though it basically, and he had Newton had said that I was wrong.
Okay.
But Darby said you don't really mean it, type of thing. Mm-hmm. And there were other tensions too, because they were basically the two prominent figures, and they were at odds with each other. Mm-hmm. And so you get two factions in the church: one that's following Darby, one that's following Newton. and so Darby had closer connections on his side that owned the building they met in, and so basically they closed it up to anybody that said they were on Newton's side, and so some of Newton's people, and so Darby at that point excommunicates Benjamin Wills Newton.
Now, did they do like an inquisition and ask people if they followed Newton's beliefs?
I'm not sure how they determined that. If it was just people they know that had, like, stepped up in support of him, I'm not sure. So Darby excommunicates Newton, and so then his followers kind of step up, and then he excommunicates his followers, and so then some of the followers go down to Bethesda, where George Mueller is in charge. Some of them go there, and George Mueller calls on all the other brethren churches, Darby calls on all the other brethren churches and George Mueller to uphold his excommunication, to not have anything to do with these people he's excommunicated, and Mueller ignores it. And so some of the Bethesda people, come and Mueller allows them to. And when I say Mueller, that's just there were a few different elders, but he's the well-known elder there, and kind of the one that they all look to lead.
He was the first among equals.
Yeah.
He was kind of like the head.
And so this is they would, like, rotate through who preached and stuff. Right. But yes, he was the one they looked to.
Yeah.
And he just kind of ignores it and says, no, these are Christians. We are non-sectarian. Mm-hmm. If they believe that Christ died for their sins, they want to take communion with us, they are welcome. Mm-hmm. And so he does that, and so then Darby excommunicates the Bethesda Fellowship, and then he goes further to say anybody that doesn't excommunicate whoever we excommunicate is not welcome here. And this is how you get into the exclusive. So basically, from that, you get this exclusive brethren group that says you have to adhere to what we say, and only the people that adhere to what we say are open to communion with us. Like, if you take communion with somebody else, you're out, type of thing. And this that kept going even further. I was looking into it a little bit. So basically, and this is an area too where I don't want to focus on it too much, because it's I would call it kind of a dark stain on the brethren, on John Nelson Darby.
Mm-hmm.
But the exclusive brethren, if you search it now, it just talks about a cult, because today, you get the sole leader who's called the Man of God, like that's his title.
Wow.
And they have a whole different bunch of rules.
Sounds like the priest.
It is. So it's almost like the Pope, except for they're way more legalistic.
Oh, you only have one person in the whole movement that's called the Man of God?
Yes.
Oh, wow.
Yes. And that was that started with Darby.
Yeah.
And so it was Darby, and then he died.
Did he himself take that title?
He didn't take that title himself.
Okay.
That's what they call the man at this point, the leader of the exclusive brethren. Darby didn't take that title, but he did become like, all right, basically whatever I say is what
we believe.
And another distinct. So Darby argued that we need to have unity as a whole Christian church, not just independent. Mm-hmm. Whereas the other side said, no, we just want independent churches. Like we can have unity while still being independent as each church.
Yeah.
Was what they argued. But Darby wanted unity in the whole thing, which basically...
You mean unity of beliefs, right?
Yeah.
So everyone believes the same thing.
And basically whatever he said had to be adhered to. Mm-hmm. And he became the sole leader of the exclusive brethren. And then that's been passed down until there's one man who's still the sole leader, called the Man of God, and very legalistic, that basically... Like, I looked at some of their rules. It was like, you can't own pets, you can't do political office, you can't visit other churches, you can't join a trade union, you can't live in the same building as a non-Christian, even if it's an apartment complex. Mm-hmm. Like, if your child gets excommunicated, you can no longer live in the same building as them. Like, those type of things where you're reading through and like, this has gone crazy.
Yeah.
But so, to talk about where the other side went, is... So they basically just stayed more true to the original ideas of, non-sectarian is what George Mueller held to, and independent, like I said, that each congregation is independently governed by a plurality of elders.
Now, with that, is that do they have voting at that time, like most Baptist churches did and do, or was it just basically the elders give the major decisions regardless of, like, they don't ask for the congregation's approval?
I believe, I could be wrong on this, so if anybody wants to fact check this, I believe it's more the elders decide.
Okay. Elder rule. There was a little thing about the elders. So, and it's kind of ironic. Darby's character arc. So that in about I think it was 1839, in Bethesda with George Mueller, they thought, we're kind of biblically we should have elders, and so they set it up, and basically I think they just recognized the men who were doing the work of the elders. Up to that point, they didn't call it. They just refer to anyone as elders.
But then at that point, they said it's biblical to have elders, and like I said, I think they looked around and said, we've got a handful of men that are doing the work of elders, so we are going to recognize you as elders. And I don't know if they voted on it or how they did it at that point. Mueller was one, Craik was one. I think Chapman is another last name of one of the guys.
Not to be confused with Robert Chapman, by the way.
Yeah, I don't remember his... it may have been Robert Chapman.
Or was it?
Robert Chapman lived a long time. You can check that. But anyway, as he's looking that up...
Oh, it was Robert Chapman. Was he...
Yeah.
Wait a second. He was a brother?
Yes.
Oh, wow. Oh, that's the guy that I've read about. Okay, you can go on. Robert Chapman is he's very like, if you want to read a good biography, read a biography about him. He was an excellent man of God. True man of God.
So anyway, they set up these elders, and Darby disapproved. He thought that he was afraid that if you set up these elders, it'll just basically become another select group of ministers. We'd reverse towards the Anglican Church again, where we have this formal leadership. And this is another thing too, that if you go into a brethren church today, open brethren church, so the open is the opposite of exclusive, the group that stayed open to people coming. that any
believers participating in the Lord's Supper.
So that any formal leadership, any arrangement would hinder the Spirit. He said. So by having elders, you'll hinder the Spirit.
Who said that again?
Darby did.
Okay.
And so this is actually a debate within some of the open brethren churches now about how much structure to put in, because so you have ranging from not much structure to just get up and preach to the idea that
get up and preach. What does
or
that
not
mean?
get up and preach. So just like it's open. If any man wants to step up and say something, he is able
do
to
it.
as the Spirit leads. Is what they'll say.
Gotcha.
So
basically, sit in the room until someone has has something impel them to get up and speak.
Correct. So that's the one side, and then
The question is, when do you end? That's the question.
When everyone gets hungry for lunch.
Okay.
No.
Gotcha.
And then the other side is right to the side of, well, say if like some group, you sit there for a while and nobody gets up, and you say, well, maybe if we have some structure to this, especially to try to get some of the younger men to speak that are maybe a little more timid or haven't done it yet, and we ask, if you think about it and prepare something that's a few minutes long, type of thing. And so there is debate amongst how much structure, how much to just let the Spirit lead.
And that's a loaded term.
It is
because the one group defines the Spirit leading as the Spirit leading through plans determined beforehand.
Yeah.
And then the other group refers to the Spirit leading as like inner intuitions of I should do something.
Yeah.
Or something like
that. Yeah. No. So yes, you've hit it on the head there for
so
how
they define the Spirit leading differently.
Exactly. But so that anyway, kind of like just that wording that Darby used for that is still.
Did he use that terminology?
He used the term
Spirit leading.
He used the terminology. It would hinder the Spirit, which is something that they'll say those terms still. People, like I've heard that several times.
He didn't say it would quench the Spirit.
He said hinder.
Okay.
But anyway. So he disapproved of them having elders because of this, which again is kind of, you see a little bit of the irony he goes towards the exclusive and becoming a little bit tyrannical.
Yeah.
In that the whole start of this was we don't need clergy and laity, and maybe he saw it as I'm just overseeing it so that there's not so bad things don't happen, but we still don't have clergy. Like I gotta imagine he saw it somehow that way. But just the irony that. We can't have elders because it's clergy. We can't, but we don't want clergy, but I'll just be in charge type of thing, Let's see. Any specific thing you wanted to mention?
I wanted to talk about what exactly the brethren did during their meetings.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Because this is an issue that I'm passionate about. That when we meet together as believers on a weekly basis, we have more participation among believers, especially with regards to opening our mouths and speaking to each other. Yeah. Because now you see that this is the main passage that is debated on this issue, and I believe it was debated back then as well. Is 1 Corinthians 14. Starting in the verse 26, Paul says, "What is the outcome then, brethren? When you assemble, each one has a psalm, has a teaching, has a revelation, has a tongue, has an interpretation. Let all things be done for edification." And then he says in verse 29, "Let 2 or 3 prophets speak, and let the others pass judgment. But if a revelation is made to another who is seated, the first one must keep silent. For you can all prophesy one by one, so that all may learn, and all may be exhorted. And the spirits of prophets are subject to prophets." And then the women are to keep silent in the churches. But the main thing being there in verse 26, each one has a psalm, has a teaching, has a revelation, has a tongue, has an interpretation, and then the prophets alternating. So, I correct me if I'm wrong, but even today, and I think it was back then as well, there was a lot of emphasis placed on at least men who felt they were gifted participating in speaking, offering a word of encouragement, or instruction. So how exactly do you know the specifics of how they did that in the 1800s among the brethren, and maybe differences among them, like during and also did they have two separate meetings in the 1800s? One called the breaking of bread meeting, and the other just the regular regular service.
Super well versed on that. I do know that
because to give you the context, today, at least in the assembly that we are in, there are two meetings. There's one devoted to the Lord's Supper, devoted to remembering basically the gospel, the basic elements of the gospel, Jesus' death and resurrection, mainly his death. And that's called the breaking of bread, where it ends with celebrating the Lord's Supper. And then the other meeting is just the regular Bible hour.
Yeah, and so I would say in the Lord's Supper, the breaking of bread, that is open for any man to get up and say something, and it's supposed to go towards remembering the Lord's death,
right.
or to ask for a hymn,
or about salvation,
or to ask for a hymn to be sung,
right. About salvation.
Yes. And
it should be focusing upon the gospel.
Yeah.
Right? Not like a hymn that's telling us to like rise up Christian soldiers.
Yeah.
So on.
And so you get several different members saying something during this one. And then in our second meeting, it's more of we sing some songs, and then one person that is supposed to preach that week gets up and preaches a sermon, and then we close. I don't know for sure. I suspect it was similar to that in that several of these guys were noted preachers, that people would come to the church to hear them preach.
Okay.
So I suspect
they still had a sermon.
Yeah. Yes. And I know
at least most
when I read George Mueller's biography, I think when it would rotate through, and he was supposed to preach every third week or something like that.
Okay.
And so, every third week, he would come prepared to preach. So, but I also know they met in the manner that each person gets to say something. So I suspect that they still had the two meetings like we do now.
Correct. They didn't allow back then. Even then, they didn't allow women to speak in the public meeting.
And also, I would say so. The brethren are very when you talk to, or when you read on theologians referencing them. Most are very impressed by their wanting to stick to the scriptures.
You're talking about they're impressed with brethren today or brethren back then in the 1800s?
I would say more towards the ones back then, because they're better known than the ones today. Because it became, as the 1800s went through the 1800s, it became a large, I shouldn't say large movement, but
larger
and
hundreds of thousands
and well known. Whereas today I would say it's a very small minority.
Right.
But so probably referencing back then, but we're impressed by they just read the Bible and try to stick to what it says, and in how they meet as well, obviously. And so we were just about how they met back then. So yeah, I think they had two meetings would be my guess. Oh, also another thing was, so occasionally on the church service we do an open platform, which is
ours, Casey and mine.
Well, yeah. So
personally,
so at our church we do an open platform, and I guess I should describe what that is first. Open platform is during the second service when somebody usually preaches. Every once in a while we do it so that is open for any man to get up and to preach for a period, and it can be on any subject. It doesn't just have to be on the gospel at that point.
Right.
But so why I bring this up is that I know that this was a prominent feature of brethren assemblies back in the day.
The 1800s?
I think at least the early 1900s, and so I'm assuming that it developed from this, and I do think it was something that they did back then, that a lot of the brethren assemblies no longer do.
Oh, okay.
But it was something that was prominent back then, in that yes, we do have times of preaching when it's whoever has something to say, whatever man has something to preach can stand up and preach.
Right. It's based on 1 Corinthians 14, where it says your prophets can prophesy one by one.
And if there's any, like, I know my father-in-law usually listens, and he is way more versed in the Plymouth Brethren. Mm-hmm. So if you want to let me know what things I was wrong on later, please do so.
Okay. Also, one other thing I wanted to know, at least one other thing, is that in the early days, most of the time they were meeting in houses. That's correct, right?
So, very early, yes. Remember, they did have several upper class connections. Mm-hmm. So, as they got bigger, they quickly were able to be like, say if Lord whatever was like, I've got a warehouse, mm-hmm. We can meet there, type of thing. So, it's kind of a mix of like that house feel, like meeting in somebody's house, and like, a bigger thing. So they did start out in houses. They quickly grew. Like I said, by 1840, the one had like over 1,200 people.
Yeah, when they started, it was mostly Lord's Supper meetings.
Yes,
that was And basically, like, obviously they would encourage each other, and they might study the Bible, but it was mainly celebrating the Lord's Supper together.
Yes,
which they call the breaking of bread.
But so I think due to their upper class connections, mm-hmm. as they grew, they were fairly easily able to find larger buildings to use.
Now, do you know, because this changed the dynamic, when they use the larger buildings, do they set them up like your average church sanctuary with the seating, facing forward, or did they have a more circular seating?
I do not know what they did. I know that this was another thing that the assemblies used to do more before. I think a lot of the bigger ones that are still around have, and when I say bigger, I don't mean huge, but big enough to build their own building, mm-hmm. have it more as like a typical how you'd view a church. But right. I believe they did used to meet in a circle.
Okay.
And I don't know if that goes back to this.
Mm-hmm.
So other things that I know, and we can ask some of the older folks at our church, I do know that they used to have a single cup that they'd pass around, and they'd all just sip from the same cup.
Right. That comes from the Anglican Church.
Oh, okay. That makes sense.
I mean, it comes from the New Testament as well.
Yeah.
In the New Testament, it says they had a single cup. This is the cup of the Lord's blood.
Yeah. But, so I'm not sure exactly what the look like of the early 1800s was.
Okay. All right, that's cool. Well, I think we covered it pretty well. That's the Plymouth Brethren in a nutshell, I guess. So a lot of things to think about. We should. I think we should. Like, this is something. I think this is. This is actually I've seen in just my perception of the way that things have been going in the United States in evangelicalism is some reforming church practice has been pretty growing movement, I think, and I think that's something we should think about because. It's just like the Anglican Church was a throwback or throw over, or I'm sorry, not that's not the term I want. It was basically just a different form of Catholicism because we get a lot of our church traditions come from Roman Catholicism, from the Reform, even in the Reform movement. So going back to the New Testament. And seeing that it's a priest, the church is a priesthood of all believers, that everyone has a gift, and actually more people have speaking gifts than you would think, because the New Testament says over and over again, we're supposed to encourage each other, comfort one another, exhort each other, admonish one another, warn one another, teach one another, and so on. So,
and I would say too, and I kind of mentioned this at first, but in my experience in brethren churches, the overall Christian maturity level of believers is quite a bit higher than other churches I have been in, because when everyone is encouraged to speak and prepare themselves throughout the week to be able to lead, it puts more on them to have to read, have to be ready. It's not just go in, listen to the guy, and leave.
Right.
And so I do think that this model, doing it as the 1 Corinthians passage said, really helps believers to mature.
Right. Absolutely, because you have to use your gifts.
Yeah.
And like even gifts that you would otherwise not think you had.
Yeah, and I do think that is one of the tragedies of the American church today, is that so many people are never even asked or put into a situation to use their gifts. And not to say that, like, if you go to a Baptist church or a church with a pastor, that some of them do work harder to try to promote people using their gifts.
Right.
But like, obviously not many.
Not during the service.
Not during the service, yeah. And it's more like hospitality, teaching, like Bible studies, and that's good stuff.
Right.
But yes, actually encouraging a multitude of people to teach, and also even just hearing different voices, getting different perspectives, I really appreciate.
Yeah. The question is, in our meetings together, are we coming together to just receive, most of us, and it's just a small minority that actually do the work, like encourage and build up the believers, or are we coming together for all of us collectively to build each other up and encourage each other? That's the distinction between that clergy laity model, the more Old Testament Catholic type model, where you go to receive, to get from the guy or the small group of guys that are gifted for that task and who are called for that task.
Well, hopefully gifted. A lot of times,
right,
not so much.
Right. Or you're going to give what the Lord has given you to others, and everyone is called to give something. That's the issue at stake. Whether we're being built up by a single man or a small group of people, or we're all collectively building each other up through everyone using their gifts, like I read in 1 Corinthians 12.
Yeah. And I would say too that no matter how we do it, because of sin in our hearts, like, none of it's going to be perfect.
Of course.
Like, there's issues in every way you do it, but I think looking at this, the trying to mirror it as close as possible to the biblical way,
right,
is really the goal.
Right.
And understanding that, yes, no matter what way we do it, there's going to be pride. There's going to be all types of things coming in. But I do think that this way really is biblical, and I think you see the fruits of it building people up to a higher level.
Of course, yeah. And also, a last thing is the promise of the Lord's Supper.
Yes.
That in the New Testament, the early church gathered together for the purpose of... That was the main activity, was to celebrate the Lord's Supper, because that was the family meal. They actually had it as a meal, which is another issue, which may be for another podcast. But, I don't know how we want to end. I guess go to the New Testament, evaluate your Christian life. How are you using your gifts for other believers? What is your relationship to your church? And I guess just be faithful to the Lord in what He's given you, and be a good steward of your gifts. So until next time, we hope you'll look for the King's hand in your life and in everything. We are planning on our next episode being on The Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis, an important and popular book that has some relevance for the situation we're in as believers. And please pray for us. Please check out our Facebook group, The King's Hand in History Students, if you are desirous of connecting with us. You can also email me. My email is in the contact info. And also check out my new book, which has reference to this topic, The New Testament Revival of Western Christianity. We can have a revival through going back to New Testament practice. So until next time, thanks for listening, and God bless.